Hello and welcome to Riptide Lab. Today we're talking about breaking singleton on Fetchlands. This was a bit controversial when I wrote about it back in 2013, but today in 2021 there are a number of prominent cubers like our friends over at Lucky Paper who break singleton on Fetchlands in their cubes. So why Fetchlands? Let's start actually by talking about dual lands. In a traditional dual land cycle, a 2-color deck can run one of the cards, a 3-color deck can run 3, and a 4-color deck can run 4. And what this means is that if you're drafting a 2-color deck, you are hard capped at 10% of the fixing in the environment. Now, back in the day, it was pretty common for 360 card cubes to run just 3 cycles of fixing. Usually, a shock land and dual land cycle were locked in. And the third one would be maybe sometimes fetch land, sometimes a tap land, or worse, like signets. If you were drafting, say, Gruul aggro, at most you had these 3 lands available to you. And if, say, a teamer drafter came and nabbed one of those, you were left with a deck with 2 fixers. And I've had retail decks with better mana than that. And if you looked at, say, the early iterations of the MTGO Vintage Cube, the decks that were viable were generally either super greedy decks or monocolor aggro, because multicolor aggro just didn't have the consistency to compete. Fetchlands, however, work quite differently. Provided you have the corresponding dual land, a 2-color drafter can use 7 of the 10 fetchlands, 3-color drafters can use 9 of them, and any 4-color deck can use all 10. So a big thing that fetchlands do is allow your 2-color decks to have better equity in the fixing market, because they no longer have that hard 10% cap. A 2-color deck with a single dual and a handful of fetch lands has a pretty functional mana base. And for a lot of cube decks, getting the right land on turn 1 is often enough to set you up for the whole game. And this holds not just for 2-color decks, but a lot of 3-color decks also. A couple weeks ago on stream, we were playing around with randomly generated 3-color decks. The mana bases were a trio of shock lands, 5 fetch lands, and 9 basics. I went back and looked at the opening hands, and a majority of them are actually like this, where any fetch land will let you cast everything in your hand. But if you think of this face down card as saying, sample one of these 3 shock lands at random, it's basically a coin flip rigged against you. Only 1 out of 3 will work. Fetch lands actually reduce the number of non-games that you experience due to color screw, because you can just fetch out the duel that lets you cast the spells in your hand. Now this is a bit subjective, but I really do like the way fetch lands enable splashes. I think it adds a lot of deck diversity and replayability to your format, as opposed to something like mono red, which looks pretty similar from draft to draft. And a couple weeks ago I showed off this blue-white deck that double splashed for red and black. And just between these 2 cards, there's already like 3 different synergies. And I don't know, personally, I really like giving the drafters this sort of freedom. Another kind of fringe benefit of fetchlands is that they reduce the chance of biblical mana flood. For this, I did some simulations. So I simulated 40 card decks with 23 spells, 17 lands, and I compared 2 scenarios, one where you have no fetch lands and one where you have 5 fetch lands. And for each case, I simulated 100,000 games where you start with between 2 and 5 lands in your opening hand, and looked at how many lands do you draw over time. And in this particular simulation, I set it so that each turn, if you have a number of lands in your hand, you pick one of them at random to play. And you can change the parameters to say that you play your fetch lands first or your fetch lands last. It doesn't really change a lot. But what we're going to look at is the number of lands that you've drawn each turn into the game. What we have here, the black line is the no fetch lands situation. The blue line are from the decks that have 5 fetch lands. And we're looking at the cumulative number of lands drawn per turn of the game. You can see that in the early game, these lines are pretty much identical. Having fetch lands doesn't really impede your ability to hit your early land drops. But as the game goes on, it's less and less likely that we end up in this super flooded region. And these are just averages. I think it helps to drill down a little bit further. In this graph, we look at the number of turns to draw 6 lands, which is usually enough to operate on for a cube deck. And the black line shows us that in the no fetch situation, it takes on average 7.4 turns. and for 5 fetches at 7.6 turns on average. And these curves are pretty much identical. So once again, you see we can hit our early land drops, but if we look at the number of turns to draw 10 lands, that with the 5 fetch situation, it's happening much later. So we're looking at like a turn and a half more to get all the way to 10 lands. So those are some arguments in favor of running more fetch lands. As for arguments against, well, this is the main one I can think of. Thank you for watching. Bye.